Welcome to the Newsbeat Podcast, where we examine critical issues of social justice. Each episode features interviews with prominent writers, educators, thought leaders, and activists, and is infused with original music and verses from independent artists. The Newsbeat Podcast, the New York Times Podcast Club Pick of the Week in January 2018, and featured podcast on Best of the Left. Here's your host, Manny Faces.
Hey everybody, this is Manny Faces, the producer and host of Newsbeat. Welcome to another electrifying episode where we meld social justice journalism and original music to examine some of the most pressing issues of our time. As always, Newsbeat is brought to you by Morey Creative Studios, a New York-based inbound marketing and sales retention platinum HubSpot partner agency. Check them out at moreycreative.com. So we're tackling a very controversial and extremely relevant topic this time around: the United States' extrajudicial military prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, otherwise known as Gitmo. It was opened up in the wake of 9/11 and filled up, and then President Obama tried to empty and close it, and now Trump wants to, quote, load it up with some bad dudes once again. There are currently 41 inmates being held there indefinitely, the majority without charge, let me stress that, without charge, down from more than 700. And as you might have noticed from our episode artwork, we've titled this America's Black Hole. That's because international law, aka the Geneva Conventions, don't apply there. Well, critics say they actually do and should, but the United States doesn't think so. Thus, the torture, or as the government's called it, enhanced interrogation techniques you've likely heard about. Now, this episode was the first time we've ever conducted all of our interviews in one spot on the very same day, in front of the White House actually, under the watchful eyes of the Secret Service, DC Police, and rooftop snipers. We covered protesters dressed in orange jumpsuits and black hoods demonstrating against the prison on the 16th anniversary of its opening, January 11th. You'll hear them singing and chanting in the background. Among those we spoke with were Mark Fallon, author and former deputy commander and special agent in charge of the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Task Force.
It's become a rallying cry for violent extremists. And so for years, Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib were the number one reason that foreign fighters came to the battlefield.
Pardis Kabriai, a senior staff attorney at the nonprofit Center for Constitutional Rights.
The detentions at Guantanamo, they're extreme, they're unprecedented, there is no parallel, and the courts have been responding to other extreme policies of the Trump administration, like to the Muslim ban, to other indiscriminate policies, and so we're hoping that they step up.
Shelby Sullivan-Bennis, a staff attorney for the international human rights group Reprieve.
It's illegal, and it's been illegal ever since its inception. It was designed to be a prison outside of the law, and there is no such thing, and there should be no such thing.
And Robert McCaw, Director of Government Affairs for the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR.
Under the Bush administration, hundreds of these worst of the worst individuals were actually released, which meant that we wrongly detained them, or that they were incorrectly held for a certain period of time.
Now, regular listeners will know that we typically enlist a musical guest to lay down rhymes to complement each episode. But you know what? Being there in DC, meeting and listening to these attorneys and activists and actually witnessing several get arrested firsthand, I was moved and inspired, so I took this one on myself. I hope you don't mind. Now, I think it's important to note that wherever you stand on this issue, like I said, this is a hot one, and make no mistake, there are some very evil people at Gitmo, such as alleged 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But whether you believe that all those held there are quote-unquote terrorists or enemy combatants and deserve what they get, or that everyone, no matter who you are or where you're scooped up, has the right to the presumption of innocence and a day in court, as our democracy deems justice, you have an absolute right to an opinion, and an absolute right to voice it freely, without fear of being labeled anti-American or a terrorist, let alone get snatched up and tossed into a place like Gitmo. As Newsbeat's editor-in-chief likes to say, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, questioning your government is one of the most patriotic things a citizen can do. In fact, it's your duty, it's your obligation, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So here it is. This is America's Black Hole: indefinite detention, torture, and terror at Guantanamo Bay.
When Guantanamo was open, it was supposed to be a temporary facility, and the thought process was that we needed a place to bring suspects so that they could be exploited for their intelligence value, and and they could be brought to justice, so they can be investigated. And so Guantanamo was selected as a location that was off the battlefield, and the president made a decision, President Bush at the time, on the 13th of November 2001, to utilize a process called military commissions rather than our Article 3 courts, Article 3 under the Constitution, our constitutional court system. He decided that it was in the interest of our national security because he feared further attacks. And those decisions were made out of fear, ignorance, and arrogance. And so we sent out on a process to utilize a new system called military commissions, which hadn't been used in years, as a method to bring terrorists to justice. The first detainees arrived on the 11th of January in 2002.
The first plane load of prisoners from Afghanistan has landed at Guantanamo Bay Naval Station in Cuba. 20 prisoners were flown from Kandahar on a C-141 cargo plane that landed at the U.S. military base today. They were dressed in orange jumpsuits and caps and wore face masks. All the prisoners had their hands bound. Some were wearing leg shackles.
And they arrived into what was called Camp X-Ray. And the military, and I had been to Guantanamo before in the 90s when the Cuban-Haitian refugee crisis, we had a number of refugees there, when our motto was care for migrants. And so they had some very primitive facilities called Camp X-Ray. They would look like a dog kennel. There were cyclone fences with 2 buckets, one for drinking water, one for human waste. And it was supposed to be a temporary facility. And it was just meant somewhere to hold them until they can build another place. And they did, and they moved.
At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said the prisoners brought to Guantanamo Bay will be treated in a manner consistent with the Geneva Convention.
Being the kind of a country we are, it's our intention to recognize that there are certain standards that are generally appropriate for treating people who are prisoners of war, which these people are not. And you know, to the extent that it's reasonable, we will end up using roughly that standard, and that's what we're doing. I wouldn't want to say that I know in any instance where we would deviate from that or where we might exceed it. Technically, unlawful combatants do not have any rights under the Geneva Convention. We have indicated that we do plan to, for the most part, treat them in a manner that is reasonably consistent with the Geneva Conventions to the extent they are appropriate. And that is exactly what we have been doing.
I represent one of the men who continues to be detained at Guantanamo without charge, Sharkawi al-Hajj. He is a citizen of Yemen. He's 43 years old. He's been there since 2004, held without charge for over 2 years before he was brought to Gitmo. He was held in CIA black sites and brutally tortured.
Ineffective and brutal, those were the findings of the Senate Intelligence Committee into the CIA's detention and interrogation program following the 9/11 attacks. US facilities around the world were put on high alert in expectation of the fallout. The chair of the committee defended the decision to release the long-delayed report.
History will judge us by our commitment to a just society governed by law and the willingness to face an ugly truth and say never again.
And today he is suffering the effects of his past torture, suffering the physical and psychological effects. He's damaged. He's on hunger strike. He weighs slightly over 100 pounds, a very slight, kind of gaunt man when I see him at Guantanamo.
I want to be absolutely clear with our people and the world. The United States does not torture. It's against our laws and it's against our values. I have not authorized it and I will not authorize it.
New allegations of abuse have surfaced engulfing America's most infamous prison, Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. The claims were found in documents obtained and published by Reuters and surround the case of a 35-year-old Pakistani man named Majid Khan. Khan says CIA officials in the detention center sexually abused him, poured water on his genitals, and beat him, with some of the perpetrators smelling of alcohol.
So, the problem with a lot of these cases is that much of what is in the government's case is classified, but what's unclassified is that he was arrested in 2002 in Pakistan, in what the government says was a safe house. The government accuses him of having been a facilitator for Al-Qaeda. They thought he was a big deal. They thought he was a a major figure, and so they rendered him to CIA sites and interrogated him under torture for over 2 years for that reason. At the end of 2 years, I think they probably concluded that he was not as big a deal as they thought he was, and that's when they transferred him to Guantanamo. The government continues to hold him on the basis of past conduct from nearly 16 years ago, part of which he disputes, but that as a matter of law, you can't just keep holding him or anyone at Guantanamo on that basis without more.
So we have 2 clients currently who are cleared for release of 5 men who are. One of them, Tawfiq al-Bahani, has been cleared since 2010, which means that he's been waiting every single year since then to be released. On 2 different occasions, he was told that he would go home. He was measured for new clothing to leave the prison. He was given pain medication for his bad back for the flight home. And that flight came and went, and he was not on it. And he's never been given an explanation as to why. And he continues to wonder if he will ever go home. And then we also have another client, Abdelatif Nasser, who's a Moroccan, who was cleared in 2016 and was supposed to go home to Morocco. The Moroccans were interested in taking him back, essentially. We had spoken to different Moroccan officials. The United States wanted him to go home. A 6-agency panel cleared him unanimously for release, and there was some snafu in the paperwork, and they just didn't get it in on time effectively to meet this 30-day deadline that Congress has imposed. And because of, essentially clerical error, this man remains in Guantanamo today and may for the next 4 years at least. It's illegal, and it's been illegal ever since its inception. It was designed to be a prison outside of the law, and there is no such thing, and there should be no such thing.
Dear America, I understand your fears. They grew up in a place very different from over here, and they've suffered many things that many of us just couldn't bear. And to be fair, it's kind of the reason many of them ended up there in Gitmo, brought there fast to live slow, go directly to military jail, don't pass go, and many of them shouldn't see freedom. It's true, for committing violent acts against our red, white, and blue. And ever since the days of our initial revolution, when we get attacked, it's fair to want to dish out retribution. But when the punishment spills outside the Constitution, we're adding to the problem instead of finding a solution. And modern day terrorism did change the game, but time-honored honoring of human rights remains the same. Framers made those claims, so we can't just go and change the framer. We're no better than the ones who flew them planes.
Guantanamo is sometimes a forgotten issue, especially in Washington, D.C. We only really heard about it recently when President Trump, during the campaign, pledged to refill the prison. But widely, Congress has done very little to end this forever prison, and the White House supports it.
This morning I watched President Obama talking about Gitmo, right? Guantanamo Bay, which by the way, we are keeping open. And we're going to load it up with some bad dudes, believe me. We're going to load it up.
Mr. President, do you want the assailant from New York sent to Gitmo?
I would certainly consider that, yes.
Are you considering that now?
I would certainly consider that. Send him to Gitmo. I would certainly consider that, yes.
Under the Bush administration, hundreds of these worst of the worst individuals were actually released, which meant that we wrongly detained them, or that they were incorrectly held for a certain period of time. Under the Obama administration, he pledged to close the prison, but he was only able to get it from a little bit over 100 down to the 40s. And so we still have 40 people left in the prison under Trump.
There we go.
With the stroke of a pen, President Obama began overhauling the way the United States treats terror suspects. Mr. Obama signed executive orders that will close the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, ban the harshest interrogation methods, and establish procedures for handling future detainees.
We're going to lead by shutting down Guantanamo and restoring habeas corpus in this country so that we offer them an example.
I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that.
For many years, it's been clear that the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay does not advance our national security. When I first ran for president, it was widely recognized that this facility needed to close.
And obviously, they brought up the concern about Guantanamo. And I understand their concerns, but let me explain my position. First, I'd like to end Guantanamo. I'd like it to be over with.
This was not just my opinion. This was not some radical, far-left view. There was bipartisan support to closing. So, in one of my first acts as president, I took action to begin closing.
We have a president that's threatening to refill this prison, and at the same time, some of these individuals have been cleared for release. Now, those who are accused of a crime, they should stand trial. They should have all the rights that are afforded to any other American citizen during a trial. If they're found guilty, they should be sentenced and properly sentenced. That will provide justice for any of the victims of terrorism, but also provides justice for Americans, knowing that our law is being upheld and those who are being innocently held are cleared and they're released and they're sent back to their families.
The justification that the government uses to continue to detain these men comes from the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which, when you think about it today, being used to detain new captives who could potentially land in Guantanamo, it's outright absurd that it be used because it's so outdated, because the detention authority that did exist initially under the AUMF would have unraveled now, because if you consider our ability as the U.S. government to detain people in Afghanistan, we are actually no longer able to do that. So the prospect of having detained them still elsewhere, bringing them elsewhere somehow, means that we can detain them forever without charge or trial is completely irrational.
I want them right where they are. This is a place that has proven to be an important asset. Guantanamo Bay works. It holds these worst of the worst terrorists who killed Americans and provides an opportunity for us to continue to collect intelligence such that we can take down these networks and keep America safe.
In my opinion, the only problem with Guantanamo Bay is there are too many empty beds and cells there right now. We should be sending more terrorists there for further interrogation to keep this country safe. As far as I'm concerned, every last one of them can rot in hell. But as long as they don't do that, then they can rot in Guantanamo Bay.
2 of the people who were part of this action were actually approved for transfer by the government itself. And their basic argument is that detention of this length, that is still indefinite, and it's clear that it is indefinite under this administration, clearer now than ever. Detention of this length that is still without end is unlawful. It's illegal. It's not constitutional. It's not permitted under international law. It can't continue, and that they have to be released. That may sound like a radical thing to say, but these detentions are unprecedented in the history of this country. There is no precedent for wartime detention of this length without charge that is still without end. There is no precedent in the federal criminal justice system for holding people who have never had an adjudication of guilt, who've never been charged, tried, and convicted, who are simply being held on the basis of a preponderance of evidence.
It's hard to understand why a man shouldn't be taken from his land for being Al-Qaeda or Taliban. But when every captive captured is not who we think we caught, when the lines are blurred by offers of rewards, many innocent pay the cost. Some are kidnapped for bounty, freedom lost. Traders trade a man for 50 grand and get him tossed into black helicopters, faces draped in black cloths, from black sites into this black hole with no support, no court, just sexual assault and physical abuse, sensory deprivation, isolation. And the truth? It's not creating an improvement. All it's doing is refueling enemy tools for recruitment. Who do we think we're fooling? What goals are we pursuing? Since when is torture something we're okay with doing? The same way we say they hate our freedoms and despise our democracy. We need some checks and balance on hypocrisy.
Thinking about how Guantanamo is a black hole is something that frankly continues to evolve for me, because I continue to be shocked by it. And I've been doing this for a few years now. My notes are read by the government before I get to see them myself. I don't get to take some of them with me. I have to leave them in a particular place, in a particular state. And in order to see them, I have to go visit them physically. My clients are not allowed to receive letters of support from anybody. If it's not legal mail, I can't send it. And they're not allowed to send messages out to the world. Technically, there is a process for this, but I've never heard of it happening. And that's the type of thing that Guantanamo is. There can technically be a process, but in reality, it's something else. You know, their families have absolutely no way of ever visiting them. And many of them, especially in these times after year 16, they're considering whether they should just cut off communication with their families. Like, is it kinder? Because they don't know if they'll go home. And if they were given a proper sentence, even if it were, a life term, they know what they're dealing with and they know how to move forward. But the idea that indefinite detention is torture is so prevalent to me every single day.
I want to be absolutely clear.
Force-feeding inmates at the Guantanamo Bay prison is torture and breaks international law.
The United States does not torture.
That's how the United Nations labelled the treatment of detainees at the facility.
It's against our laws and it's against our values.
As many as 23 prisoners are now being forced to eat through nasal tubes as a mass hunger strike that nears the 3-month mark.
I have not authorized it, and I will not authorize it.
You know, the detentions at Guantanamo, like I said, they're extreme. They're unprecedented. There is no parallel. And the courts have been responding to other extreme policies of the Trump administration, like to the Muslim ban, to other indiscriminate policies. And so we're hoping that they step up. I mean, the courts have not done justice in these cases for a long time. There have been critical moments in the past when they have stepped up and they have responded, and we're hoping they do that again. They just exercise their role in being a real check on the executive branch.
It's become a rallying cry for violent extremists. And so for years, Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib were the number one reason that foreign fighters came to the battlefield. Unfortunately, today, that may not be the number one reason. ISIS, Daesh, ISIL are using videotapes of President Trump saying waterboarding, we're going to do worse, actually advocating for war crimes that is being used to incite violence against Americans. So to make us less safe, you just keep that rhetoric up. The President Trump has said you need to fight fire with fire. That's the talk of an arsonist. You fight fire by depriving it of oxygen, and you deprive it of oxygen by changing your narrative and adhere to the Constitution.
The 14-year nightmare of the last British prisoner at Guantanamo Bay could soon be coming to an end. The U.S. announced last month it will release Shakir Amir, imprisoned without charge at Guantanamo since February 2002. Amir says he was working as a charity worker in Afghanistan when he was kidnapped and handed over to U.S. forces. During his time in captivity, he claims he was subjected to abuses including torture, beatings, sleep deprivation, and being held in solitary confinement for nearly a year.
But I was shocked. The first day I was shocked. Not the first day, the first second I arrived, because the first thing they tell you when they drag you, they don't even allow you to walk. They drag you on your feet, just drag you, pulling you, and your feet hit the stairs and all that, and they just on the bus, and they said, this is the end. This is the end of your life. You will never leave this place again. You know, the closest thing for my mind, you know, is a Harry Potter story, you know, because I read it. You know, they got an island in Harry Potter, it says Azkaban, where there's no happiness. They just suck all your feelings out of you, and you don't have no feeling anymore. And truly, that's how I felt all the time. This is Azkaban. This is not from this world, you know, because that's what they tried. You know, they want to make you feelingless. They want to deprive you from everything, anything.
Like Azkaban, stranger in a strange land, not engaged in any plan, but still estranged from his fam. Enraged, but it fades with the hourglass sands, and he's damned by the hands of a man named Uncle Sam. An eagle flies by, but it looks the other way. It doesn't matter. To a hungry eagle, everything is prey, so it's just another day like the thousands before. And while the eagle soars, the stranger stays shackled to the seashore. This is unprecedented, not what we represent, not how we claim to be, not what is written in the text. It forms the basis of the destiny we seek to manifest. By treating people less than people means we're failing all the tests. While assailing all these rights, we're trailing off the righteous path into the wrong. Why fight all these battles if the end result is that all of our so-called integrity is gone? This is bigger than a prison or a podcast or a song. Man, this is crazy.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Twarowski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat. Newsbeat. Real issues, true journalism, dope beats.